My name is Penny Duff, and I'm based in Glean, Michigan, and Chicago, Illinois. So my work is grounded in a desire to animate vernacular spaces with creative practices and critical inquiry. And this is a work that I've been thinking about a lot over the years. It's always been very informed by place, and I currently find myself living in environments that's very different from anything I've ever lived before. So it's a very unique opportunity for me to think about talking about this work, which feels very, very early. So I thought I would start by sharing first some of the experiments and some of the ideas that have been informing my practice along the way. The first is this quote from Rebecca Solnit. This was just an off-the-cuff remark that she made in an interview in The Believer magazine in 2009 that has really stuck with me. She says, "I still think the revolution is to make the world safe for poetry, meandering, for the frail and vulnerable, the rare and obscure, the impractical and local and small." And to me, this idea of the local, impractical, the small, making space for tiny revolutions, really, it really resonates with me, and I continually find myself asking how, as an educator and an organizer, I can serve this mission. For me, it has been very helpful to look at other models for guidance along the way. And so, I've been asking a lot, sort of, what are some of the other ways that this kind of an idea of the revolution, of the impractical and local and small, how has it been embodied across time and space, and sort of what are some potential next iterations? So for me, this revolution is Helen and Scott Nearing, who abandoned urban life in Manhattan in the 1930s to embark on a radical experiment in self-sufficiency in rural Vermont, where they taught themselves how to construct all of the buildings on their property using locally foraged rocks and little else, and where they harvested just enough maple sugar from the trees on their property to support themselves. They called it bread money, and they devoted the rest of their time to scholarship, music, and other pursuits that they found more valuable than money. It's also Black Mountain College, which is another rural experiment, a school in the mountains of North Carolina where the pedagogical philosophy was rooted not only as engagement with great thinkers and makers of the time, but as a series of embedded life practices that formed the viability of their mode of intentional communal living. For me, it's also the fact that Sun Ra was from Saturn. It's also Alice Waters' famous restaurant Chez Panisse in Berkeley, California, which is a testament to the way that one extremely persistent person advocating for the critical importance of local foodways and responsible farming can lead to a movement grounded in a very intense sense of joie de vivre that is illustrated, among other things, by the fact that the employees' on-the-job wine consumption tally ran so high that it sank the bottom line for about the first decade that the restaurant was in operation. But it was nonetheless considered important to the greater mission, so they let it, until they got a business manager eventually. It's also Pauline Oliveros' extreme slow walk, one of her many deep listening practices, the challenge of which is that, to quote her, "No matter how slow you are walking, you can always go much slower." I really recommend trying it. It's Rural Studio, a design-build program in rural Alabama, where architecture students gain firsthand experience in the field, creating innovative public spaces that adapt and extend vernacular structures, and where they've been for years in the process of devising a prototype for homes that can be built for $20,000. And that comes out to $8,000 in materials and $12,000 in labor. And finally, it's Appalshop, a collective of documentary filmmakers, roadside dramaturgs, and radio disc jockeys who have been embedded in the Appalachian Mountains in eastern Kentucky for nearly 50 years, empowering local people to shape the narrative of their lives in the region they call home through a really radically inclusive collaborative platform. So for me, these models are each very distinctly in their own way, illustrate possible responses to the idea that Solnit puts forth about a type of revolution. And they're undeniably tethered to and shaped by the places where they exist. And so that has led me to the question of where is the place that will shape my own response to this idea. So for me, since 2014, my response has been on this piece of, primarily I would say, on this piece of property in Southwest Michigan in a rural township called Galeen. It's here where my husband and collaborator Michael Slaybach purchased a wasted acre of land that housed the remnants of a house and other outbuildings that burned the night before Thanksgiving the previous year. Abandoned for the months that followed, the site resembled an ideal set for an emerging filmmaker's post-apocalyptic masterpiece, much more than a place to call home. But the location could not really be beat for us. It's right across the street from the place where we were married, where our dear friends live, and we didn't really imagine that they'd be asking much for the property, so we thought we could probably afford it. So we embarked on a multi-year project to bring this piece of land back to life and see what we could make of a life out in the countryside. With the help of a local renegade contractor named Happy Jack Richter, we burned and buried the remnants of the house, and as well as other structures on the property that were not salvageable. Then we designed and built a home, acting as our own general contractors, which was totally legal, kind of amazing, and doing much of the work ourselves. And this photo right here shows when we were just exiting what was affectionately known as the Lego stage. And then we have subsequently took the advice of a farmer friend of ours in the area, and we observed our surroundings for the course of our first year before making any other decisions. Observing the way the landscape changes from season to season, and sometimes from hour to hour. And through this year, we began to really notice how much the landscape was shaping us. So as we've settled in here and been thinking a lot about my work, it's been manifesting itself in two spaces, the domestic space of the home and the broadcast space of FM dial. When we designed the house, we knew from the outset that we wanted it to be a multi-purpose space, and so half of the house is one large room that we call Storehouse. And this is a photo from our first sound check at Storehouse on New Year's Day. We have a really simple premise for this project, which is to invite people over, ask them to bring a dish to share, bring a bottle, and infuse the space with community, art, and a sense of ease. And we find that house concerts are a very perfect vehicle for this. Our first show was on New Year's Day, was William Tyler and James Elkington, each did a solo show. And in the spring, we hosted $75 Bill and Sue Gardner from New York City. And for each iteration of the Storehouse, we produce a zine that serves as both a program for those in attendance and something to pop in the mail for the many more far-flung folks who we hope to share this experience with in some way. The zine showcased the work of our friends as well as our idols, and we asked people to write bios for each other. Catherine Irwin of the Louisville-based band Freakwater writes haikus for each issue, and really, the zines are just an attempt for us to extend the intimacy and the ideas that infuse our home when it morphs into Storehouse. And they provide a lo-fi way for us to think about the larger question of how to invite others into this ecosystem that we want to create. The other medium that I've been tinkering with is low-power FM radio. Since August of 2016, I've been broadcasting a weekly freeform radio show on our local station, Radio Harbor Country. That's 106.7 FM, 93.5 FM, depending on where you are. You can see our antenna here is on the Three Oaks water tower. And WRHC is powered not only by 100 watts of community, as some of our board members' favorite slogan goes, but it's also by about 30 volunteer DJs who produce a distinctly idiosyncratic array of programming for the airwaves. The station is home base for my show, Vernacular Media, which is an hour every Saturday morning spent exploring the everyday. The show provides a platform for me to play with how the ideas, people, art forms, and other concerns that permeate my everyday might find a home in this new environment. Each day, I play records from Arthur Russell to Yoko Ono, Alice Coltrane, Willie Nelson, and beyond. I present a random reading and share unsolicited meditation advice. And I introduce listeners to recipes ranging from David Tanis's Save Your Life garlic soup to Jessica Koslow's turmeric tonic and my grandma's famous pasta salad. The recipes definitely seem to be everyone's favorite part. Our local grocery store greeter has referred to me as the recipe lady. I don't know how he recognized me, because it's radio. And I regularly find myself discussing the medicinal benefits of herbs and vegetables at social gatherings when I least expect it. Oftentimes I sneak in short interviews with people who I invite to join me in the studio to discuss their passions. The more esoteric, the better. My own dad, Charlie, provided an in-depth tutorial on turkey calling techniques and the psychological nuances of turkey hunting. My neighbor, Roberta, joined me to discuss one of her great loves, which is lavender. And other guests have included New Jersey's Toddophonic Todd, who called in to give advice on how to be a better DJ. And this was the critical... It was my New Year's resolution. But critically in this episode, I learned that dead air was okay, so it was very exciting. Filmmaker Noe Kidder demonstrated flamenco dancing on plywood sheets brought in from the shed, and Chicago-based artist Rachela Marie Brown discussed the self-care activities that comprised a significant part of her time as an artist in residence at the Roger Brown's home in nearby New Buffalo. So to conclude, I just wanted to state that these are sort of some initial ideas as I myself embed a little bit deeper into my new environments. And these two platforms have really provided me a way of reflecting a lot lately about how to open up these conversations even more and what the revolutionary potential that could be unearthed in the coming years. So it's kind of an ever ongoing research process for me. That is in part why I'm so pleased to have the opportunity to share the space with these artists and scholars who are on this panel today. So thank you.
My body of, it's kind of two bodies of work. They're one body of work. Some of it is my own personal work, and then some of it is the work I do with my collaborator, Jonas Sabura. And they are intertwined, but different, but the same. And so I would not be here without Lisa Stone and Jim Zanzi, and that they have really kind of challenged me to look at things that were far outside anything that I knew when I got to Chicago in 2010. And so a lot of the work that I started making from that point on is really kind of thinking through these self-taught artists and the vernacular and artist environments. And so I think a lot about the narratives of the place that I grew up, which is in a pretty remote part of northwestern New Jersey, and that it was a really rural community that I was very bored in. And so through skateboarding and punk rock and art, I kind of found an out to these kind of larger places of culture. And so I think a lot about the kind of narrative structures of a lot of the tableaus of the self-taught builders, like the Fred Smith concrete site, and how he's building these environments or these tableaus that kind of tell about his experience and the people that he's encountered. So my experience of growing up in New Jersey and not having very much money, but very much wanting to be a part of something bigger than myself, that in you would like buy a white tee and then write your band, like the band's name on it, and then it would get really gross and you would wear it all the time because it was the only thing you had. And so these are kind of like my hardcore t-shirts. So they're just t-shirts soaked in resin with kind of different phrases, kind of playing with language in different ways. This is a sculpture that my collaborator and I did. So it says Foo Fighters, but fighters is crossed out, and it says Fugazi, which is this like seminal post-hardcore band from Washington, D.C., and thinking a lot about the kind of the awkwardness of the human form in developmental stages of life. So how uncomfortable I felt in my body from the moment that I recognized I had a body to how I still feel now as a 33-year-old, and that there's really not that much difference between being a really horribly awkward 14-year-old and being a semi-professional 33-year-old. And Jonas and I have a lot of conversations around that and thinking about how the physical space that we share as collaborators can be kind of siphoned down into these formal decisions within the sculpture. So it has these big, shiny, swollen feet and really bad hair and a t-shirt that's way too big. This is the bag head buddy, where again, big swollen feet, bad hair sticking out from the bag. This thing is like 4 feet tall. And so thinking of these really simple kind of sculptural gestures that kind of in the same way that Fred Smith or Mary Knoll, they're kind of working in these fairly simple sculptural gestures to talk about the human form or to talk about some type of figurative form. So in 2015, I started a body of work that was my own in my studio, and I was thinking a lot about the concrete sculpture park, the Wisconsin Concrete Sculpture Park, and how Fred was using the materials that were around him to create these tableaus, and I started thinking a lot about my friends growing up and kind of the people that had really been around me and kind of formed who I was as a person and what those materials were that were around me. So these sculptures are made out of carpet and pantyhose and helium tanks and these kind of really simple non-materials in a lot of ways, that they're also, the sculptures have this feeling of being somewhat unfinished. And again, like distilling the human form down into these really odd gestures that kind of became, the formal gestures became these kind of links to like an emotional feeling in those developmental times. So Jonas and I, I'm gonna like skip around a little bit. We did the residency in the Foundry at the Kohler factory last summer, and we are really interested in signage, and this is really hard to tell in the image, but these all have text scribed into them. I think the only one you can probably read is the one that says "nothing is fucked." So sorry, not sorry. And so we made a series of like 20 of these. They're plated cast brass, and they each have a different inscription in them, and they're related to a project that I'll actually end the lecture on. So this is just the list of things that are dead. So dead wrong, dead set, dead air, dead arm, dead tire, dead leg, so on and so forth. And so we were thinking a lot about the language that gets used between us, that gets used between our kind of cohort of peers, and how the language that we use or that we're exposed to can be this other tool for defining a space. We also made a set of cast iron pans that have these different sets of symbols. We're really interested in vernacular symbol making, particularly that of itinerant travelers during the Great Depression, and kind of developing these sets of symbols around our own practice, looking at Oddfellows symbols. So this is a little bit of an ode to Jesse Howard, because in the bottom it says sore heads, which we like to think of ourselves as, because we love Jesse. So misfits, romantics, sore heads. So we made a series of pans. There are editions of 2, one for me, one for Jonas, while we were in residence. And then a big part of our practice has been architectural and kind of thinking about physical architectural spaces that talk about the physical relationship between Jonas and I. So this piece is actually, we both used to work at an artist residency in Western Michigan called Oxbow. And there's a lot of these vernacular Western Michigan lake cabins that kind of populate the campus. And so we decided that it would be a good idea to build an Oxbow cabin in a canoe that we could live on together for 3 weeks, which was interesting. And so then we lived on and off it for 3 weeks. We had parties out there. We kind of hosted events where people would float out in tubes and hang out. We would grill. And so, but it was this kind of piece where we really started thinking about what does it mean for the two of us to occupy a space that is 11 feet long by 20 inches wide, and how do we navigate the physical intimacy of that space? So, and that has kind of been this like constant moment of thinking in our work since then. This is a project we did in New Orleans a few years ago that's called Juke Joint for One, where we proposed to the gallery that we would build a space on the outside of the gallery, thinking there's no way they would let us do it, and then they emailed us back and said, that sounds great, which was great. So we actually had, we knew that we were going to build the structure. We were thinking a lot about the environment builder Clarence Schmidt, and that we wanted to build this kind of window structure that came out of the second floor of this building, but we were having a hard time reconciling what we were going to do with the inside. And so we actually had to pick up a sculpture here at the Art Center, and then we drove the Mississippi River Road to Memphis, where we installed that sculpture, and then went from Memphis to New Orleans. And in Memphis, we stopped at this place called Wild Bill's, which is a really old juke joint, and just had this moment of realizing that we grew up on the East Coast. We had been kind of embedded in a really particular set of like cultural like understanding, and that we were moving into these places that really were the roots of American culture that we hadn't really been exposed to before, and that it was so profoundly moving for us, and that we wanted to kind of create this space that when the viewer came into the gallery, they could then go into this space. So you would walk through that door, crawl through the exterior window, and then be inside this space. And that you could have this moment of being in that architectural space for yourself that had an ambiance that we had kind of fell into while we were there. So there's a record player that's playing Fats Waller, and a ceiling fan, and all kinds of little things. And then this is another project we did where we were thinking, Jonas had left Chicago, moved to Kansas City, and we were trying to figure out how we were a collaborative from a distance, no longer working in the same studio, and how we still kind of talked about architecture. And so we did this project where we built this palette of things, of material, which would essentially build you a really, really shitty hotel room. And it was based on these drawings that we were making on the descriptions of architecture in a series of books that we were reading over a 6-month period. And so then we kind of very subjectively distilled those architectural spaces down into this drawing, which is our own blueprint, and then palletized all the material that it would take to create this space. So in theory, you could ship this material anywhere, build yourself your grimy hotel room, pack it up, and ship it somewhere else, and build it somewhere else. This is, so while I was still living in Chicago, my friends and I, who I shared a studio with, like I said, going back to like skateboarding and punk rock being these formative spaces, we were now in our 30s, all played music together, realizing that we could never be in a touring band. And so we did this project where we built a room that was the size of the inside of a Ford Econoline van, like a touring van, and set all of our stuff up in it. And then Peter.
Top, it's just like, oh, seriously, it's just like a little button with a red dot.
We had wanted to do that at a gallery for an opening that we had, and the gallery said, no way, someone might get hit in the face with flying material. So what we ended up doing was running a U-Haul, parking the U-Haul in front of the gallery, keeping the door to the U-Haul closed with an extension cord running out the back, and then someone ran out of the gallery and plugged it in. We played outside really loud for 10 minutes, drew everybody out into the street, and then drove away, and then came back to the gallery. No one knew it was us. And they're like, were you here when that truck came? It was really crazy. So that was our, like, we can't break the thing, so we'll do this other thing to disrupt the evening. But again, this issue of like that seemed like a space for us, and there's this band called Friends Forever that would tour, and they would play their show in their van outside the venue, like as the opening act, and a lot of us had seen them, and that was kind of this really interesting way for us to think about a communal space that travels, that has all these different layers of meaning. And then the final thing I'll talk about is this is a project we did here at the Art Center in 2014 called Church. And we were looking a lot at things like the Dickeyville Grotto and these other kind of vernacular-built grotto spaces, looking at Gordon Matta Clark, looking at Jesse Howard, and thinking about the skate park as our kind of sacred or spiritual space growing up, as a place that we went that got us away from the complications or the things that were really problematic, that we found to be problematic where we grew up. And so we also covered it in hand-painted signage that we made as our nod to Jesse. There was a sign that says Sorehead Hill somewhere on it, but these are some of the signs. Yeah. And then this is like, I had a funny moment where we were putting the signs up, and Karen had asked us to not put any signs with bad language on the front of the ramp. And so I tried to sneak this one onto the front, and she immediately flagged it and said to the back. So, and then the great thing was that at the very end of the exhibition, the Art Center so amazingly accommodated what we thought was a huge ask, and we're skeptical of have happening, and they cleared all the rest of the work out of the gallery, and we held a big public program where we brought in a bunch of local skateboarders and some people from Chicago, and held this big event that brought in a huge crowd of people who hadn't really been comfortable with coming to the Art Center before, and that felt kind of like this really kind of magical culmination for us of bringing this different levels of space into the institution. So that's all I got.
Thanks. All right, we're gonna take some time to listen to a lot of things. I don't have too many pictures to look at. I apologize. I hope it's still interesting. But I thought I would just start by saying thank you to Lisa Stone specifically. I think that my experience in school was one at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago that really changed the way I thought about the work that I could make. And I probably wouldn't have arrived at my current art practice without really taking some time to think about art existing outside of an art world that we get so immersed in school. So I just wanted to start by talking about this project I did immediately after school called Play Some Songs to Make the Plants Grow. So I grew up in South Carolina as an first-generation Arab American, which was incredibly complicated, as you might imagine, if anyone is from the South. And so I've always kind of had a relationship with the landscape that I haven't quite understood until recently. And I think that in any way I can explore other people's relationships with the landscape, it has helped me kind of understand why I feel like it is so important to me and my identity. So when I heard about a few places that I went to visit on this road trip after school, I was thinking a lot about where we place ourselves in our environments. And so one of the most important places, I won't talk about all of them, was Noah Purifoy's Outdoor Desert Art Museum in Joshua Tree, California. And this is kind of a really amazing place where not only are things just placed out in the desert, but they also are affected by the desert landscape in the same way that our bodies are affected by the landscape and the environment. So you've got the hot, hot sun beating down on metal sculptures, which are incredibly hot, and the just relentless wind kind of blowing things around and making sound. And so with this project specifically, I started to make field recordings of what that sounded and felt like, and improvise some music to go along with that. And a lot of these are kind of meditations on what's happening in an environment and really understanding your placement within that. So I guess we'll start by looking at this image, because this was really the only great documentation I have of doing these performances. But we'll start by listening to a performance I did at our Mother of Sorrows grotto in Iowa on the Appalachian Dulcimer. So I'm going to just talk over this a little bit. With a lot of these improvisations, I spent time meditating with the space and really kind of thinking about what is already existing in the environment, what kind of living score I'm performing with. So I would notice, for example, kind of blooping of the just like water tank. I don't exactly know what created that sound at this reflecting pool at the grotto. And this living soundtrack of birds around, and thought about how kind of reflective that experience is, just thinking, and how that could also be reflected in sound or music. I not only play Appalachian dulcimer, but I play the cello, I play the guitar, I play the drums, I play a lot of other instruments, so I feel I'm constantly trying to think about what makes sound and what possibilities for sound there are, which is what was so exciting about playing along with Noah Purifoy's site, which we'll listen to a little bit of next, which was improvised on electric guitar. And I think the most important thing I learned from the experience of recording these pieces was that sometimes it's more important to not play music as a musician, and to just be aware of what else is happening. And as an improviser specifically, if anyone plays music knows that you also have to allow space for the other person to act, and in this case, the environment was my collaborator, and just allowing for some meditation within the landscape was something that became incredibly important to me, and since doing this project has become a huge part of my artistic practice. So I'm just gonna skip ahead to some more recent work, which involves working with an international collective of artists in northwest Scotland, in an incredibly remote area. It takes about 24 hours to get to this house that we work at, and then from there, it's about an hour walk up to the house. So a lot of the things that we make or have there are what we can easily bring with us in backpacks, or only recently have we decided that we could maybe get things shipped to us, but it's actually really inconvenient to do that. So I think next year still we'll just go back to bringing things along. So a lot of the work that we do as a collective is research and collaboration. I have an almost entirely collaborative practice. And taking care of the house that we stay at is another huge part of that. So I found this willow tree that desperately needed pruning. And then with the ends of that, I was thinking about, what kind of possibilities for sound there was with tree branches. So I've made a tambourine of willow branches and some limpet shells, which were all everywhere, actually, around the shore, which is about a 10-minute walk from the house. And I also made another percussive piece, which I call the shell lute, although it isn't exactly one of those. Let's see if I guess we lost some of the video slides. But with these pieces specifically, I was kind of thinking about this new kind of environment that we were all creating at this house in terms of like what's at hand and what we can do together. So there's some video works which are in progress. I guess I should have mentioned that this work is incredibly new, just within the past few months. In terms of building a set of instruments or tools for contemplation within the landscape in Scotland. So we've also find other objects around the house. In this instance, there's just a piece of wood that's been around for a while, and myself and my collaborator made a psaltery, which was really hard to do because neither of us have ever built instruments before. We're more concerned with the potential for sound that things have and not necessarily how to make those things happen. So, I mean, if anything, they're just tools for performance, and the performance itself is not necessarily important. But as you can hear, it does kind of sound like, I wonder if I can start it over. It does sound like a stringed instrument. Sorry. But, and then I just included some slides here of some work that I just recently finished 2 days ago, which is still in the studio stage, just going along with what's at hand in the environment and what has the potential for making sound. My collaborator, Fionn Duffy, who I also work with in Scotland, and I made this concrete bottle wall, which doubles as a pipe in blowing in each of the bottles. You can create a different sound and has different opportunities for performance, which we still haven't quite figured out yet. We also made a kick drum of a painting because landscape painting is over. And the landscape is more important than the painting. So we're kind of experimenting with how we can make sounds with that. We're building some vibration amplifiers, contact mics, and other sort of new tech things to experiment with how we can include field recordings in sculptural work. And in addition to that, this is like a copper plumbing pipe, which we twisted up kind of to like mimic what we would think a plumbing pipe would look like it sounded like. So I don't know, but it's really incredibly hard for me to talk about my work because I feel like I'm still in this really new stage of working and making. But this is kind of where I'm at, and I'm always willing to talk about it more.
Thank you. My name is Michael Lynn. I'm also really grateful to Lisa Stone and to Kohler and to Pete and Valerie and everyone that is just making this amazing thing happen. So today I'm speaking about a garden that sits about an hour north of Rome, Bomarzo's 16th century Sacrobosco, or the Sacred Wood, or the Villa of Marvels, or the Monster Park, depending on who you ask and when. And I have two kind of ideas that I want to cover in my time. First is to share in photographs my own experience over a series of visits to the garden, and to talk through what I was able to learn and understand as a student pretty new to the field by being there in person, both in terms of the individual sculpture's situation within the terrain of the park, as well as the park's geographic situation within the landscape around Bomarzo. And in thinking about the landscape the park belongs to, I'm considering it pretty broadly and diachronically, looking at both nearby Etruscan ruins as well as other Mannerist gardens produced around the same time in neighboring towns. And there are also artist-built environments in the area from the 20th century that I want to mention here to kind of orient us, even though I'm not discussing them in detail. In particular, Tommaso Buzzi's La Scarzuola, begun in 1956, and Nikita Sanfal's Giardino dei Tarocchi, which she worked on from 1978 to 1998. And along those lines, the second piece that I want to touch on is a little bit that we do know about visits by artists and writers to the Sacrobosco shortly after it was rediscovered outside of Bomarzo in the mid-20th century, and the way that they've played into the reception of the park, given that it was largely abandoned and unknown outside of the area for the 300 years following the death of Vicino Orsini, who commissioned the park. So I was introduced to artist-built environments in Professor Lisa Stone's Better Homes and Gardens course at SAIC. And my academic background is actually in the architectural components of contemporary fashion shows and exhibitions. So I was very much drawn to thinking spatially through the sites that we were introduced to and trying to understand what it felt like to be there, how placement and terrain might affect how different components were perceived. And so when I had the opportunity to visit sites near Rome, I was especially eager to get to Bomarzo Sacrobosco because I had not yet been able to get the sense of place from the material that was available to me. Online and in print, the garden seems to be represented almost exclusively in really closely cropped photographs of individual sculptures. And so from Chicago, I could figure out a kind of loose list of these objects, but had no sense of how the garden functioned in its entirety, how it functioned as a space rather than as a series. And so thanks to the Rhodes Scholarship for Research and Travel, I spent my first 4 days in Bomarzo in May of 2015. I found the garden and surrounding area quite compelling and returned that same November, and again the next November, and I'm now in the process of moving there. And so if nothing else, I can serve as a kind of anecdotal data point for the general magnetism that the place seems to have. And I'm really grateful to have been able to see the park in so many different modes, like Penny touched on, at different times of day and in different seasons, because the garden can take on a really wide range of characteristics. In May and September, it tends to be blindingly sunny, but in November, it's consistently quite foggy until early afternoon. And the park is a fairly well-known tourist attraction, so you might have the place to yourself in the fall, especially at dusk. Always go at dusk. But on a morning in May, the parking lot is likely full, and the park is all but guaranteed to be completely overrun by adorable school children. So in the compound around the park are playgrounds and picnic areas, so it attracts a lot of families on the weekend as well. For these reasons, the garden can feel today like a kind of ongoing contradiction, operating to degrees and often simultaneously both as a meditative nature trail and a completely campy theme park. In addition to the shifting mood of the garden, my biggest impression has been of the importance of the landscape and the ways in which the sculptures and trails and piazzas seem to very much emerge from it. And in the last year, a write-up of the site by Monica Sween has been translated from French and posted to the Spaces archive. And I'd like to quote from that here because I think it gives a good sense of this sort of texture. With its successive terraces, its interlacing, and its stairs connecting various levels, the park predisposes visitors to wandering and meditation. Carved directly into the rock, the statues seem to have grown from the earth itself. The gray color of the volcanic rock, mixing with tones of oxides, along with the vegetation and the play of shadows and lights, all contribute to create an almost hypnotic atmosphere. In addition to its organic seeming appearance, I want to convey as well here the degree to which it is difficult, if not impossible, to orient yourself within the park. I don't necessarily mean that you feel disoriented or lost, but rather in the sense that you cannot hold the entire garden in your mind at once. The 5 or 6 interlocking terraces that it's built on do not clearly present their perimeters, and most sightlines you might have from one to the next are very much obscured by trees and bushes. And as I've experienced in visiting neighboring late 16th century gardens, specifically at the Villa Farnese in Caparola and Villalante in Banaya, it is Bomarzo's resistance to a cohesive whole that really sets it apart from its contemporaries. The blend of nature and architecture, the use of classical and allegorical figures, the prominence of water throughout the site, as well as the subtle and overt whimsy, can all be found in other Mannerist gardens, and yet they read completely differently. And you get a sense of this when you look at them from above. Specifically, the use of terracing is quite legible and geometric at Banaya and Caparola, while you can see at Bomarzo, there's something very different going on. I want to return now to the texture of the park and the way it seems to emerge from the woods that it is situated in, because there's a certain light bulb that goes off if you're able to visit the nearby woods. If you continue down the road from town behind the park, there's the enormous Monte Casoli Nature Reserve to the west, and on the opposite side of Bomarzo, the town, to the east, is another series of trails through Etruscan ruins, including the Pyramid of Bomarzo. And it was only after being able to spend time in these places that the garden really kind of clicked into focus for me. While it's still mysterious and enigmatic, it also kind of now makes absolute sense. I'm talking about a general affinity and resonance between the Etruscan villages, long submerged in dirt and vegetation, and the sculptures that seem to emerge from the Sacrobosco, but there are also a couple somewhat more literal parallels that I want to highlight. So one is the mausoleum at the park, with its funerary niches meant to mimic Etruscan niches, including those that can be seen at Monte Casoli, not far away. The other is a carved room near the pyramid that just completely took my breath away when I first walked into it. Without thinking about it, it felt exactly like being inside the Hellmouth at the park. And it could be total coincidence, and I'm certainly not arguing that there's some sort of direct inspiration or reference happening, but I would argue that the Sacrobosco should be, at the very least, considered within the larger context of the surrounding woods. Can you tell which one is which? One of them has a tooth. I'll tell you anyway. So switching gears and looking at the historical context, there's a kind of mid-century literary and artistic who's who list of visitors to the park, from Salvador Dali to Mario Praz to Alberto Moravia to Herbert List. And while I'm still working on tracking down more details, it does seem like most of these visits did happen. And like we were hearing this morning, it seems it was the artists and writers visiting the park in the 50s, 60s, and 70s who paved the way for scholars who followed, with the bulk of academic publishing on the park happening in the 1960s and especially 70s and 80s. I want to wrap up with one artist who I've not seen listed among known visitors, but who I'm convinced must have been there, and that's Pier Paolo Pasolini, seen here, photographed in Rome in 1953 by Herbert List. And something I found out while wandering in the woods and speaking with people in Bomarzo that I might otherwise have no idea about is Pasolini's pretty profound connection to the area. In 1964, he filmed the baptism scene from the Gospel according to St. Matthew at the waterfalls that are within walking distance of the pyramid. And then by 1970, he purchased a neighboring medieval tower and compound that sits between Bomarzo and Kia, just one town east. And he built a home there and spent more and more time in Kia up until his death, I should say his murder in 1975. So even almost 3 years in, I feel like I'm very much still just scratching the surface, but moving back and forth in time and zooming in and out geographically has been incredibly rewarding. And I'll just say, everyone's invited, so if you want to. Thank you.
So my name is Brett Hanover. I'm a filmmaker from Memphis, and I want to talk about kind of the way my research and travel to art environments has influenced some ideas in my film work, and vice versa, go down a rabbit hole, and I hope it'll be fun. So this is a still from my most recent project. It's a feature-length documentary fiction and animation sort of hybrid film called Ruckus that I've been working on for the past couple years, which will be released soon. And you see in this still, you have a kid standing here with his imaginary friend in this bedroom surrounded by drawings of strange characters, diagrams, and they're looking through these blinds out at the outside world. This film basically deals with themes of trauma, mental health, and queer and alternative sexuality. And specifically, it takes its name, Ruckus, from this individual who was a friend and collaborator of mine when I was a teenager, who took his own life in 2008. So Ruckus, as an artist, was primarily active in the furry community, or the furry fandom, which is a youth subculture. If you're not familiar with it, the gist of it, it involves using personal anthropomorphic animal avatars in order to create kind of spaces for playful socialization. So virtual spaces for playful socialization. So like that could be online through 3D avatars, but it could also be through illustrations on name badges, or like you see here, these kind of elaborate homemade costumes. So here they are at the Memphis Holiday Inn Conference Center, one of the great virtual spaces. So Ruckus's main art project, and most of this he didn't show to anybody until after or nobody saw it until after he passed away, was this kind of elaborate fantasy narrative project, which he called Ira's End. So it's a paracosm or a world-building project. It includes maps, character diagrams, charts, genealogies, bits and fragments of stories, and this was never finished. He was always playing with it, mixing things around, continually working on it. Just to show you real quick, it spanned across a lot of different media, so several sketchbooks dating back to when he was a child, writings online on different journals, online art archives, and then a variety of costume props and digital avatar pieces that he used to perform characters from this narrative in various furry social spaces. And a lot of what was going on in his project was not just fantasy, but it was very personal. The main character was based on himself, and it involved sort of dealing with and representing things having to do with being a survivor of childhood sexual abuse, as well as feelings of dissociation and depression that he dealt with all his life. Just to kind of put this in context, this project, this kind of project, I like to think of it in terms of other kind of world building, imaginative world building projects. So just kind of going let's see, top right, you have the Angria and Gondel project of the Bronte siblings. Of course, Henry Darger's project. Marwin Call is another example of this kind of playful world-building project, Mark Hogenkamp. And then Furcadia, which is I could have chosen any example of these kind of online social spaces. And I personally, I've found it really useful to think about the different kind of virtual worlds that he was involved with and that are part of this film project in an expansive way that sort of cuts across media and incorporates children's paracosms and imaginary worlds, toy worlds, online virtual worlds, and art environments all together under kind of a category of virtual world building, which I think gives virtual reality this interesting longer history as a practice that has been remediated through over time. To zoom in a little bit, I want to talk about this aspect of Ruckus's work. This is an image that shows up frequently throughout all of his sketchbooks and that's written about extensively. It's probably the most common image, and it's this machine that he calls the Altered Dreamers Project. Very briefly, in his cosmology, you have this sort of godlike being who is asleep, and the dream of that being is this entire imaginary universe. Within that universe, there is a child who represents Ruckus, and this child is the only person who has the ability to interface directly with that dream. A sinister military force takes this child, puts him in this machine, which is a kind of full-body virtual reality encasement, and the idea is they're going to program him in order to hack the dream, program reality. I talked with Ruckus's boyfriend about this in an interview, and he was like, it's pretty Matrixy, but I think the big difference here is that in Ruckus's machine, there's not a real world to get back to. It's recursive. So the dream world and the real world are kind of nested together, and this child trapped in this machine is kind of mediating the two. The basic diagram here, I think, has some similarities to this idea of the influencing machine, which is a kind of illustration that has been drawn as a way for people to represent the feeling of schizophrenic experiences. So on the left you have, I think that's Robert Guy did that illustration. So it's showing the body as composed of machines and channels enmeshed in more machines and channels. So it's this dissolve of boundaries. And then on the right here you have this is the first published work of psychiatric art by James Tilly Matthews, which is the Heirloom. And he drew this as a description of mind control. And when he says mind control, he's representing it, or he's talking about it not just as they're controlling his mind, but they're also surveilling him. So it's this sense of, for him it was not, they put this thought in my head. It's, I don't know which thoughts are mine and which are theirs. I have no point of reference because I'm completely within this system. So it's very much about this sense of derealization or dissolve of boundaries. Now, I'm also not saying Ruckus was schizophrenic. This diagram has shown up, in science fiction, the basic idea. It shows up in media theory as a way of talking about like advertising, stuff like that. So it's a common image now, but it does have something to do with that kind of feeling. I think about 15 years ago, there was an artist, and I'm not remembering his name right now, but British artist who sort of literalized this and built this big sculpture of Matthews's Heirloom. And I kind of feel like, to me, this doesn't work in the sense that he makes it into this big, hulking, terrifying machine, whereas I think what Matthews was trying to get at was not, he was scared of this specific heirloom that looked like this with drawers and knobs and everything, but he was trying to get at the idea of the basic diagram of this machine, the system of relationships and forces that he felt he was a part of. He didn't know what it looked like, and he labeled it not an illustration, but a diagram. So similarly to that, and people may have other interpretations, but I think that, so this is the Forevertron, just down the road. I think this is another example of something that is, it sort of has a machine aesthetic. It's the image of a machine. It's maybe talking about technology. It's very, it's steampunk. But I don't think it's machinic work in the sense that I don't think that there is a diagram that you could abstract from this. Like I don't feel like there's a system at work there necessarily. But again, other people may have different opinions. In contrast to that, I visited the Integratron in Joshua Tree, built by George Van Tassel in the 1950s. And he built this literally, I mean, it's wired, very special construction to work as a machine to heal living cells and rejuvenate you, as well as time travel. Van Tassel channeled this, the plans for this from extraterrestrials, kind of in the era of contactees, when everybody kind of had their own personal alien contact that they referenced. But also, in addition to the channeled information that he had about this, it follows very closely the diagram of an invention, a radionics device called the multi-wave oscillator. It was built by, you see on the left, a man named Lakovsky. But his basic idea was that that the organization of a cell, the way a cell hung together in homeostasis, was proof of some sort of resonant life energy, and that energy could be amplified through vibrations. And the Integratron, there you see a model of the Integratron that's within the Integratron, and on the right you see a multi-wave oscillator made by Duncan Laurie that's printed. He's been doing sort of radionic art as just illustrations, but that work according to him. And it basically, what you see here is that it is the same basic circuit diagram in all these works, so you can kind of see all these works as instances of the same kind of score or machine. Just in passing, Van Tassel, he funded the construction of the Integratron with funds from the first UFO conventions, which he held in the middle of the desert near Joshua Tree. I think the energy that Van Tassel is talking about is very similar to the kind of energy that Ed Leedskalnin was working with in his books about magnetic current. He's the creator of the Coral Castle environment in Florida. And I think there's something, this is kind of my pet theory, but it's a way of thinking about it, that basically if you read both of their writings, they seem to be talking about taking an idea of sort of information or organization, so feedback, homeostasis, order and noise, morphology, etc., taking that kind of idea and then sort of reifying it as this transcendental life force. And when you do that, when you take the organization of the world and make it into this ethereal substance, you can start kind of reinterpreting everything endlessly. And in the case of Coral Castle, there's just a million interpretations that people are doing online, like incredible Coral Castle fan art, basically. And that's a real deep wormhole. Finally, I wanted to, very briefly, I'll wrap up, but thinking about Imre Blagden's work, I was kind of thinking, so he made a healing machine. Well, what kind of healing machine is it? What's the diagram? What's the circuit pattern? And how is he thinking about energy? And you read things like, functional devices arranged like a circuit board, reflectors and generators. He was building, magnetic machines. But I spoke with a few people who knew Blagden, and one thing Connie Paxton said was that he didn't really use the term healing machine, and she was very clear, and I'm sure there are people here who know more about this than I do, but she kind of spoke about the idea that he never believed it had sort of literal healing power as far as the ability to actually heal diseases or anything like that. And sort of the more I talked to her and sort of dug into it, it seems like for him, when he's talking about electricity or energy, it's not this transcendental other thing. It's very much how you would talk about sensation, perception, aesthetics, and his position within that. And when he talks about a machine, it's not this thing that he is alienated from or in some way trying to figure out the perfect plan of. It's very much a way of talking about an intuitive, embodied process of art making, which relates to, last slide, how the film closes is with an animation in which the interview segments from the documentary become animated, Ruckus's machine is reset, reality and fantasy merge, and we sort of end up back where we started at the Holiday Inn, not necessarily knowing what to do, but at least being present. So, thanks.
All right, thank you all very much for sharing. We have a time for one or maybe two questions. Anybody has anything burning they want to talk about?
Yes, and so it'll be hopefully premiering very early next year, winter, yeah.
How can we see it?
Hopefully it'll be at film festivals and venues and stuff, and then it'll be available for free online after that. Or you can ask me, I'd write it down for you, a link,
I am you 50 years later. When I was 19, I met Clarence Schmidt, and I was in Woodstock, where he made his mirrored house, and it's no longer there, it's all gone, but it infected me with his virus, just as you've been infected by the viruses that infected you. And I continue to, when I was able to, I continue to develop my art through making an environment. So I wish you luck.
Michael, I was just wondering, your research that you're doing, is it for something? Where is it? Can we find more about it? Like the work that you're doing at the gardens, you're moving there. Is that why you're moving there?
In a way, yes. It's still in 1,000 pieces on my laptop. But
It's going somewhere.
yes.
I can't wait.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is for Michael Lynn. The Sacro Bosco, was that built kind of like a ruin in the first place? Because like those tilted buildings, or did they tilt or?
So the leaning house was built originally to look just like that. It's hard to tell. The rock is really soft, so it's. Short answer, I don't think it was originally meant to look that ruined, but there's honestly just so much we don't know. And did 300 years of overgrowth preserve it, or the opposite? There's so many more questions than answers. But the things that seem off are mostly intentionally off.
Some of you may know that Alex is currently living in and doing the restoration on the Mary Knoll House for the John Michael Cole Arts Center. And Alex, I'd be curious to know, I don't see, the limited information I have about your work, I don't see many points of confluence between your work and Mary Knoll's work. But I was just curious, living there, do you see points of confluence or points of similarity, and do you see that experience impacting your own life as an artist and your own art-making processes?
Sure. I think mostly it becomes about permission, and I think that for all of the environment builders, that's my main point of connection for them, because I think and most of the other artists I know, it's like I will find any excuse to talk myself out of making a decision. You know, like it's too windy out, so I can't make anything today. But I think that I can always circle back to that effort in making where it's about giving yourself permission to do and worrying about the answer later and trusting in your the intuitive nature in your making practice that the answer is there even if you don't know it in that moment. And so I think that being at Mary's and generally feeling bad about myself every morning when I get up because of how prolific she was, that the strength of that permission becomes a little bit stronger every day for me. So.